Well, hello, my name's Steve McClure, and I'm really excited to be leading us into this third session in our series House of Cards, which we're looking at in Building to Last this year. And in the last few sessions, we've looked at some really big chunks from chapters 8 to 15 of 1 Samuel, but now we're going to hone in on chapter 16. And what has gone before really serves to set the stage for the arrival of Israel's greatest and most famous king, King David. But first, a quick recap of where we've been so far. So firstly, chapter 8, Israel asked for a king like the other nations. You see, in the time of the judges, there'd been this repeating cycle that Israel was going around, a cycle of wandering away from God, seeing his judgment, crying out to him, and then finally experiencing his deliverance. And then after a period, they go round the cycle all over again. But now under Samuel, Israel's final judge, there's been this long period of stability. But we found that his sons weren't up to the job of taking over from him. And so the people of Israel ask for a king like the other nations. And so enter Saul the Benjamite, a man who towered above everybody else, and certainly the kind of king that they had in mind, a king like the other nations. And we meet him as he's sent out to look for the donkeys. And on the way, he meets Samuel, who God instructs to anoint Saul as king. First, this happens privately, but soon we find him declared as king publicly, or at least once he emerges from the baggage. God begins to change his heart. He begins to prophesy. Saul's going to be king, but God still intended to rule his people. And he set out detailed instructions of what a king was to do or not do back in Deuteronomy 17. But then comes disaster. The Ammonites besiege Jabesh Gilead, and they'll only agree to a treaty if Israel agrees to gouge out the right eye of every Israelite man. But Saul finds out about this, and when he does, he burns with anger. And then he leads Israel to a great victory. And then in chapter 12, Samuel warns Israel of their long history of forsaking their God. And he says that their future is going to be determined by whether they and their king will follow the Lord. And of course, over 400 years of the monarchy, many of those kings and the people as a result do not follow God. But then last time, Jez took us into chapters 13 to 14. After some initially fairly positive signs, the house of Saul then begins to fall apart like a house of cards. Specifically, Saul failed to follow the Lord. He'd been given clear instructions to wait for Samuel to come and offer sacrifices to the Lord. But Samuel didn't show up on time, and so Saul takes things into his own hands and offers the sacrifice himself. Samuel rebukes him for doing such a foolish thing and failing to keep the Lord's commands. Samuel tells him that God was now seeking out a man after his own heart. The kingdom's going to pass to another. And then again in chapter 15, Saul fails again as he's commissioned by Samuel to completely destroy the Amalekites. But when Samuel arrives, he finds that Samuel had not only spared King Agag of the Amalekites, but also the best of their livestock, the sheep and the cattle. Saul is in time repentant of a kind, but Samuel tells him that God delights in obedience. And so there was no way back. And we find God regretting that he'd made Saul king. So that's the recap of where we've been, where we've come in this series. But tonight I want to look at the arrival of this new king under 4 headings. Firstly, I want to think about what I'm calling a portrait of a king. Thinking about what it says about King David. It will help us get our heads around all that happens to him here in chapter 16. And some of the things here are very clear. Others more speculative, more questions, more reading between the lines. You're going to have to sift this a little bit. So firstly, David's lineage might surprise you, but the first mention of David comes in the book of Ruth chapter 4. And the author tells us that Boaz and Ruth have a son called Obed. And Obed has a son called Jesse. And Jesse, of course, is the father of David. There's the genealogy at the end of Ruth. F.B. Meyer suggests that it's pretty likely that the family continued to live on their ancestral property, the property that had belonged to Boaz, a property in Benjamin. And as we saw previously in the dialogue between Saul and Samuel, Benjamin was the smallest of all the tribes. In fact, they got decimated by the other tribes because of a scandal that happened on their land. And you can see on the map there just quite where all these things are located. But then secondly, David's mother. David's mother is never named. Traditionally, she's called Nitzevet. Don't know if I've pronounced that right. But there are 3 references to her in the Psalms. Firstly, and David is asking God to save him, he says, because I serve you just as my mother did. We could also look to Psalm 22, verses 9 and 10. David says, you brought me out of the womb. You've made me trust in you, even at my mother's breast. From birth I was cast on you. From my mother's womb you have been my God. I think it's pretty likely that David's strong sense of faith and trust in God came from his mother. She had a big influence on him. Perhaps his poetic gift, his sensitive nature came from her as well. But we also have a verse like Psalm 69 and verse 8. David describes himself as a foreigner to his own family, a stranger to my own mother's children. Jewish tradition, as recently it's been portrayed in the Amazon series House of David, paints a picture of David as an illegitimate child. Some think this could really explain David's words in Psalm 51 and verse 5. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. And we know that his mother was alive and his father, and when David asks the king of Moab for protection for his parents. It's in 1 Samuel 22 and verses 3 and 4. So David's mother raises, or at least the references to his mother, raise a number of interesting questions. But I'd say there's actually few answers to some of those questions. I'll leave those hanging for now. And then David's father. David's father is often named in the Bible as Jesse. No question about that. But it seems strange that David so rarely mentions him. There's a particularly interesting reference in Psalm 27 and verse 4. David says, though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me. What on earth does that mean? 1 Samuel 16 tells us that David was Jesse's 8th son. He had 6 brothers and 2 sisters who are named in Chronicles, 1 Chronicles chapter 2. And so he was part of a big family. And then David's age. We don't know. We do know for a fact that David took the throne of Judah aged 30, the throne of Israel aged 37, and that he dies around age 70, having reigned for 40 years in Judah and 33 years in Israel. Suggestions are that at this point he was around 12 to 14 years old. Mike Trenier, in his work on this, of course, former international navigator president, he has David aged around 13. So it's somewhere in that vicinity. And a verse like 1 Samuel 17:33 on the screen there, we've got this suggestion that there's no way he can fight against Goliath because he's just a boy. He's been a man of war since Goliath's been a man of war since his youth. So there's this total mismatch with this young David. And then what about David's occupation and his appearance? Psalm 78 and verses 70 to 72 tell us that David was taken from the sheepfolds to lead his people. He was a shepherd. In chapter 17 of 1 Samuel, we find him going back and forth to feed the sheep. We find that he's got experience of fighting the lion and the bear to protect the lamb. And in terms of appearances, it's easy to forget that David was glowing with health. He had fine appearances. He had handsome features. David was a good-looking guy. And then what about David's status? It seems David was assumed to be too young and or too insignificant to attend the sacrifice that's mentioned in 1 Samuel 16. Indeed, he wasn't invited and only actually gets the summons once Samuel really pushes hard to see if there were any more sons. Jesse didn't seem to think he was worthy of the invite. He was somehow forgotten. Was that just because he was too young, or because he was too busy with the sheep, or perhaps even this scandal that was mentioned? Who knows? We don't know. Perhaps even David chose to avoid the sacrifice himself. All kinds of questions. But let me say that as a whole, this profile should serve as an encouragement to us all. David's meager beginnings demonstrate that God can and does use anyone in the fulfillment of his purposes. A younger Steve McClure would find it extraordinary to see how God is using me in his service. When I arrived at university, I was pretty shy, full of insecurities. And yet somehow God now has me preaching and teaching hundreds of people and traveling extensively. God is good. What the grace of God has done in my life is truly, truly thrilling. So you might like to take a moment just to reflect on David's beginnings. What impresses you about what is or indeed isn't said about his beginnings? And what do you think it was that caused God to choose this unlikely shepherd boy to be the king of Israel? Just spend a few minutes on those questions. Feel free to pause the video a moment, and then we'll come back again with our next section. Okay, section 2. Now you'll notice that I've chosen kind of popular things for movies and TV series for my points today. It's just a bit of fun, but the second thing is your mission should you choose to accept it. And we begin with Samuel's anger and his sadness. In chapter 15, you'll remember Samuel was angry when God said that he had regretted making Saul king. He cried out to God all of that night, and that chapter concluded with Samuel mourning for Saul. But now in chapter 16, God asks, "How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel?" See, Samuel is heavily invested in God's people, and Saul's disobedience had grieved him deeply. I like what Alistair Begg says on this. He says, surely Samuel had an affection for Saul. That matters. If he didn't, why grieve? Samuel was consumed with the glory of God. Therefore, when God's glory was tarnished, he grieved. Saul's failure is a big deal for Samuel. Saul, of course, was appointed amidst all the talk about how Israel had rejected not Samuel, but God himself. But now Saul has been rejected by God. And God now moves Samuel along as he instructs him to fill his horn with oil and go off to Bethlehem. Why? Because God says, I have chosen one of his sons to be the king. But Samuel is full of fear. How can I go, he says. If Saul hears about it, he'll kill me. And it's not surprising, perhaps. Going behind Saul's back was probably tantamount to treason. I wouldn't relish the task he has here. But God's already got a plan. He instructs him to take a heifer with him and declare that he'd come to sacrifice to the Lord. Jesse was going to be invited. And of course, that was in a sense true. He was able to go under that premise, but it wasn't the full picture. But it was a helpful premise to give Samuel the confidence to go to Bethlehem. And God promises to show Samuel what to do and tells him to go and anoint the one that he's going to indicate. God's going to be quite clear on this. And while Saul has been the choice of God's people, this new king is very much going to be the king of God's choosing. So Samuel goes off to Bethlehem, but now it's the elders who are fearful, and they ask him if he's come in peace, and he reassures them that he'd come to sacrifice to the Lord. And so they consecrate Jesse and his sons and invite them to come to the sacrifice. So far, so good. But the next thing Samuel sees is Eliab, and he's convinced that Eliab is the one. We're going to spend some time in a moment thinking about verses 6 to 7, but notice just for now that God rejects Eliab. And indeed, in verses 8 to 10, we find that he has rejected all of Jesse's other sons, including Abinadab and Shammah, who are mentioned by name. Samuel then asks, are these all the sons that you have? Jesse reveals that there is one more, but he's out tending the sheep. And Samuel declares strongly that they will not rest, they will not sit until the youngest was brought to them. And upon his arrival, the Lord told Samuel, rise and anoint him. This is the one. So Samuel anoints him. And I wonder what Samuel must have made of all of this. God was very clear about who to anoint, that it was to be this young, this unlikely shepherd boy who was to be anointed king. But God was also very clear that he sees very differently to how we see people. And did you notice that all of David's brothers are present when David's made king? What must they made of all of this? It's quite interesting, actually, as an aside, that further down the line, it appears that David may have made his brother Elihu, who seems like maybe he's Eliab, made him leader over Judah. Now, I don't know about you, but this must all have seemed very strange to Samuel. Those emotions he felt, anger, mourning, fear, confusion. And yet he is faithful and he obeys God even when he doesn't understand it. I wonder how God might be calling you to act in ways that seem extraordinary or unusual to you. A few weeks ago, our friend Ernest came to visit us in Southampton, but the story of how he got here was quite interesting. For whatever reason, I had this idea to ask him to lead a seminar, but without really understanding that in order to get a visa to get into the UK, it was a pretty big deal, and a pretty costly deal as well. 2 days before the event, no visa. And then all of a sudden, the Home Office texted and said, you're going to get an answer within an hour. And the answer came back positively. And within a few hours, he booked tickets to come and visit us. And a few hours after that, he was here in Southampton. It was just simply incredible. Now, I had to prepare the same seminar just in case he wasn't able to come. In a way, it was a bit ridiculous, a crazy idea. And yet God really blessed his coming, both in my family, at the conference, and many others too. So let's just take another moment just to think. Firstly, what most impresses you about God's well thought out plan to select a new king to replace Saul? And to what extent can you identify with the way Samuel feels here, and feelings of grief, feelings of fear, confusion, if you like? So pause the video again, and then we'll come back for the third part. Called this third section Vantage Point. The movie Vantage Point, 2008, shows the same event from different perspectives, each in turn. And only when you put all the perspectives together do we see the full picture of what actually happened. And I want to suggest today that in chapter 16 we find something a little bit along those lines. Because God's vantage point allows him to see things very differently from how we see things. And I think that's essentially the essence of what is meant in verse 7. Verse 7 is the verse that really unlocks the whole chapter. Let's just read that, shall we? Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I've rejected him. The Lord doesn't look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Or in the ESV there, the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Seeing is a key theme in this chapter of 1 Samuel. And I've lent heavily on a commentator called John Woodhouse. He's an Australian, who translates verse 1 in this way. He translates it as, I've seen among his sons for myself a king. It's quite similar actually in the ESV. And you see in the preceding chapters, there's this idea that Saul was the king they'd chosen for themselves. God was, of course, sovereign over the appointment of Saul as king, but it was very much in response to the people's demands. But now God has seen or provided for himself a king. This is what we saw in chapter 13 and verse 14, when Samuel spoke of how God having sought out a man after his own heart. And it's what we saw in chapter 15, and when God said he would give the kingdom to a neighbor who was better than Saul. So two ways of seeing. Firstly, seeing as man sees. In verse 6, there's another example of the word saw. This time it's Samuel who sees, specifically Eliab. And having seen him, he concludes that surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. And if we read on to verse 7, it seems clear that it was Eliab's appearance and his height that Samuel had seen. He was a tall and handsome man. Does that remind you of anybody? Look back to chapter 9 and verse 2, or chapter 10 and verses 23 and 24. It's Saul, of course. Samuel felt he had seen God's choice of king. But then in verse 7, seeing as God sees, God isn't so caught up with outward appearances, but he looks to the heart. The way that we see people will always be limited. God isn't limited at all. He sees everything. He sees what's in our hearts. And that's certainly an aspect of the meaning here of the verse. Don't get me wrong. But Woodhouse goes further than that, arguing that it's saying much more. His literal translation of verse 7 is really interesting. This is what it says: "For the Lord sees not as man sees, for man sees according to the eyes, but the Lord sees according to the heart." The way he sees is determined by his own will and purpose. And Woodhouse claims that such an understanding is critical in understanding 1 and 2 Samuel, because it helps us understand that God sees with his heart. Every commentary I've read on David seems to interpret this phrase, man after God's own heart, as jargon for a godly man, a man with a heart like God's. But Woodhouse in his commentary is claiming that a man after that it means a man after God's own choosing, a man who God has set his heart upon. It's about the place that man has in God's heart rather than the place that God has in man's heart. In technical terms, he says this. In 1 Samuel 13:14, the phrase after or according to his own heart qualifies the verb sought out, not the noun man. This could be represented more clearly in English by according to his own heart, the Lord has sought out man. And what this all means is that in these critical verses in chapter 13 and verse 14 and chapter 1 of this chapter, that we're talking about David being God's sovereign choice, rather than trying to say something about David himself. You're still not convinced, but if we jump forward to 2 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 21, we read this: "Because of your promise, and according to your own heart," that's the same phrase, you have brought about all this greatness to make your servant know it." This is the same phrase as in 1 Samuel 13:14. And Alistair Begg points out that the only differences between these verses are the pronouns. But both pronouns relate to God. So what does God have against tall or handsome people? Nothing. God loves tall and handsome people. But the emphasis here is about who is God's choice. David clearly was a handsome man. He was a good-looking man. There's much to commend about his life, even at this early stage. But no one would argue that David was chosen for his achievements or his status. No, he was an unknown, an unlikely choice. God chose him because David was his choice, his sovereign choice. Not because of anything specifically good about him or good about his heart. And God chose not to choose his brothers because they weren't the one who he'd seen according to his own heart. Woodhouse says that any outstanding qualities in David are the consequence, not the reason, for God's choice of him. This would lead us on to think, why does God choose anybody? Well, many verses seem to support this biblical theme that David was God's choice. No one's going to deny that. But what we're talking about here is central to why God chooses any of us. We'll look at the verse on the screen there. God chose me, David, from my whole family to be king over Israel forever. He chose my family, and from my father's sons, he was pleased to make me king over all Israel. And then those verses from Psalm 78 again. He chose David, his servant. Or have a look at Deuteronomy 7, verses 7 to 8. Really fascinating verses. The Lord didn't set his affection on Israel and choose Israel because they were more numerous, because actually they were the fewest. But it was because the Lord loved you and he kept his oath that he'd sworn to his ancestors, and so on and so forth. Why does God choose Israel? Because he loves them. Why did God choose us? Because he loves us. Why did God choose David? Because he loves him. He was the man that he saw in his own heart. Time and time again, God chooses some of the most unlikely people to be involved in his purposes. Lineage of Jesus, of course, is full of such people, each with their distinctive stories. And this just seems to be the way that God works, because he chooses the foolish things to shame the wise, the weak things to shame the strong, the lowly things, the despised things, the things that are not, to nullify the things that are. I quite like the way Eugene Peterson puts it in his book on David, Leap Over a Wall. He says David was just a layperson. His father omitted to present him to Samuel. Indeed, it probably didn't even occur to him. To his brothers, he was a non-entity. Worse, as we learn from examining his genealogy, he had bad blood in his family tree, hated and despised Moabite blood. The choice of David, the runt and the shepherd, to be the anointed, to be a sign and representative of God's working presence in human life and history, is surely intended to convey a sense of inclusion to all ordinary people, the plain folk, the undistinguished in their eyes of their neighbours, those lacking social status and peer recognition, which is to say the overwhelming majority of all who have lived in this old planet Earth. Election into God's purposes isn't based on proven ability or potential promise. I really like that. I don't know what you make of this. I call it the Woodhouse interpretation of these things. But for me, it fits so much better with our understanding of God's purposes throughout the Bible. And it has massive implications for David's reign, because it means that his reign's going to rest on God's promises rather than on David's performance. The nature of his reign is going to be nothing like Saul's reign. And if we look with God's eyes, we see that David's going to have a greater son, King Jesus, who's going to reign on his throne forever. Let's have a chance to respond to this. What's your response to what is a very different way of thinking about these verses? And specifically, what do you think it means that David was a man after or according to God's own heart? How do you understand the implications of this? Just take a moment. I want to finish by just looking briefly at that second half of the chapter on His Majesty's service, I've called it. But firstly, we want to see that he was empowered for service. Israel's now got two kings, although few would have known it. And when David was anointed, we learn that the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, or the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. Through his Spirit, God accomplishes his purposes. During the time of the judges, he empowers specific people for specific purposes to work out his plan. Saul was offered the same Spirit. he received this same empowering. After he prophesied, after this, he does prophesy, and the Spirit empowers him for action, particularly when he speaks in kind of acts in that time of disaster, when the Jabesh Gilead had been overtaken. But the interesting thing here in 1 Samuel 16 is that when the Spirit comes on David, we're told that it was from that day on, or from that day forward. So much more of a sense of permanence here. The word upon is a different word than usually used in this context, in these kind of instances, and it means in or into. Certainly feels more permanent than the sporadic way it's described for King Saul. Perhaps that's to highlight that David's reign would be very different to King Saul's. We've seen already in 1 Samuel that the way things are laid out is not necessarily chronological. Could be that this second half of chapter 16 actually occurs after chapter 17. But whether or not that's true, there's clearly a sense it's been placed here to show the consequences of God's choice of David as king. While David receives the Spirit, we're told that immediately the Spirit has departed from Saul. He was tormented by an evil or a harmful spirit. This was the outworking of chapter 15 and verse 23. Because you, Saul, rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. And his attendants could see this, and they express it strongly. See, an evil spirit is tormenting you. An evil spirit from God, they say. And so Saul's behavior in these chapters suggests that it really was a big deal for him. It wasn't a permanent state, but he's troubled by it repeatedly. The narrator puts this responsibility squarely on God's shoulders. It was the consequences of God's rejection of him as king. I wonder how you feel about God being responsible for some of the difficult things that we face in this life. If you're not sure that's true, have a look at Job 2 verse 10, Isaiah 45 verse 7, Ecclesiastes 7:14. See, it may not sit well with us, but if we diminish God by trying to do away with this idea that he is sovereign over everything, then we're bringing God down to our level. We're diminishing him and his authority. Who wants a God that is only kind of powerful? No, God is sovereign over everything. Saul's servants suggest a solution to try and alleviate Saul's troubled spirit by having someone who can come and play the lyre for him. One of his servants was aware that David could play the lyre. And David is then described like this. He is a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man. The Lord is with him. Given what we know of David from the start of the chapter, it seems that some length of time must have passed in between. Time enough to allow these servants to have heard about David, perhaps even the events of chapter 17. And it's interesting that the ESV translates verse 17 in this way. It says, provide for me a man who can play well and bring him to me, which is very similar to God's statement in verse 1. I have provided for myself a king amongst the sons. What irony there is here that the man that Saul sought to provide for himself would be the same man that God had provided for himself, provided to be king. Of course, Saul agrees to the suggestion. They send messengers to get David, and they bring him into his service. And David comes to Saul, and he plays the lyre for him. And we're told that Saul liked him very much. We're told that Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armor bearers. Indeed, Saul is so pleased with David that he writes again to Jesse, asking that David remain in his service. And when he plays the lyre for King Saul, we're told that relief would come to Saul. He would feel better. The evil spirit would leave him. David's ministry to Saul had a huge impact. And as we come to a close, it's quite interesting to see what Isaiah writes about another shoot of Jesse. Just listen. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots, a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him. The Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, and the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes, or decide by what he hears with his ears, but with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. These promises were hinted at back in all the way through the life of David. But they were fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And we too minister in the power and enabling of that same Spirit. The impact of our lives on other people will also be significant because this same Spirit lives in us. Last couple of questions. What role does the Spirit play, both through his presence and his absence, in the shift of direction for King Saul and King David? What does it mean for you to serve in his Majesty's service, empowered by his Spirit? So what do we do with all of this? I hope that what we've seen is that David is a down-to-earth man, a man that no one would have expected God to choose. Yes, he has some outstanding qualities that will grow and develop over the coming chapters. But it's more than that, because he was God's chosen man, the man that God saw with his own heart, to lead his people in the power of his Spirit, whom he gave to David. It's very challenging, yet deeply encouraging, that God chose David to be his instrument. He saw David, the shepherd boy. He saw how he looked after the sheep, and he chose him to lead his people. God's thoughts and God's ways are not at all like ours. He loves to work through the unlikely, the unexpected, the unqualified, as he works out his sovereign purposes. God was and still is seeking out men and women after or according to his own heart, the people that he has chosen to work out his purposes through. You see, God wants to work through people like us, Spirit-filled believers in Jesus Christ, who are willing and open to follow his calling.